So I got a little bit ahead of myself and I sanded the rim before I talked about the bowl that I'm going to work on. So this is a piece of walnut that I turned almost exactly 2 years ago. There's a date, 2016, July 20th. So yeah, just a hair over 2 years. So it should be dry. It's cracked a little bit. There's a hole. There's a hole in it, which I'd be into just leaving and not filling, but there's a number of other cracks in the bowl, so I kind of want to fix those. So there's a crack here, and then there's a little crack over here. So my thought is to at least cut this crack out, and maybe cut this quadrant of the bowl out, and cut it here at this crack. And then from there, figure out what I want to make to infill those things to then turn the final piece with sort of some inset pieces made where the cracks were in this bowl. So as far as sanding it on the drum sander, it worked and it's fairly flat. When you dry the bowl blank, it warps a little and the rim's usually not flat, so to re-put it on the lathe, it's nice to have it flat. And to cut it on the bandsaw, it's nice to have the rim flat so it'll sit. I needed to use my bowl cutting jig on the bandsaw, and the bolts that were on it were too long. This bowl's kind of flat, so I found some shorter bolts to put on the jig. These bolts help clamp the bowl down to the jig. Now I can figure out exactly what I want to cut out. And since the cracks are somewhat straight, I need to find two straight lines that the cracks fall within. Then figure out exactly where to mount the bowl to cut along those lines. Now in cutting some thickness out of the bowl, I cut the outer cut first, because if I cut the inner cut first, then I have nothing to hold on to cut the other side. So I cut the side that allows me to have a side to hold on to for the second cut. So once I do the first cut, I can just move the bowl on the jig and cut the second cut. Now the cut face has to be sanded perfectly flat so it can be glued back together again. So the straighter I can get this cut, the less sanding I have to do to make that seam perfectly flat. Now for the angled crack on the other side, I thought I could just clamp the bowl at an angle, but this really didn't work with where my bolts were on the jig. So I decided I needed some new holes in the table of the jig so I could mount the bolts in different locations on the table. So it was just a matter of taking the jig apart and drilling some new holes. So there's a smaller hole that goes all the way through, and then there's a wider hole that's only partial depth, and that's to hold the head of the bolt so the table can slide flush on that table of the bandsaw. So now the bowl can be held where it needs to be held. I'm not sure why I didn't have holes like this before. This makes this much more useful. So it's the same thing again, where I can make two cuts that take out the thickness of the crack. Now I've got a cross-cutting sled that I can use to take out the corner of the bowl where the hole is, and I can just cut that half of the bowl in half again. And there was a little section where there was a round crack near the rim that went around the pith of the tree. But I didn't end up making a new piece for this part. I just ended up making the bowl a little shorter. So these are all the parts after I cut the bowl into pieces. And these first red parts are the pieces I'm going to rebuild. And the yellow parts are the pieces I'm going to keep. So this piece of walnut actually came from the tree that I cut up with my friend Gabe. It was in his backyard and fell over. So most of it we milled into slabs, and I've had the half that I took drawing for the last 2 years, and they're about ready to use. We did have a couple of shorter sections that I cut into halves so that I could make bowls from those, and that's what this bowl is from. And I brought all of that home, and I further shaped those bowl blanks into something I could turn on the lathe, and I stacked all the slabs. So I have a second walnut blank that I need to turn into a bowl at some point as well. So now 2 years later, I can find a piece of walnut to help build the infill for the bowl that I'm working on now. So this is one of the smaller slabs on the top, and I think I can get away with half of it. So I will cut it in half and rip it in half again on the bandsaw. It's a little safer to do a slab like this that isn't nice and flat on the bandsaw. But once it's been jointed, it can be run through the table saw. Right now I'm making a flat face and a flat straight edge so I can resaw the piece through the bandsaw and get 2 thinner pieces. And I can rejoint that cut face. It wasn't very straight. And replane the piece. What I was thinking is I would make a striped pattern with the pieces that I'll build for the infill. So I have a piece of maple and the walnut to make those stripes. I can take the machine marks from the joiner and the planer and sand them off on the drum sander. And this seems to work pretty well. Now I drew a circle on my little layout table so I could start to lay out all of the pieces I was going to make to build the infill for the bowl. So I started building the corner, and that was just going to be a big striped block. I could save a little bit of wood by making sure I was only cutting the length that I needed for each part of the curve. And I can lay out the other cut that I made, and that's just going to be a simple rectangle of stripes. And these are all the segments and the pieces of the original bowl. So now it's just a matter of gluing everything up. Now it's not just a matter of gluing all the pieces all together all at once. So I can glue it up in sections, then sand and flatten the faces of those sections, then glue the sections together, and basically go through that process a couple of times to get to the final glue up. So I'll glue the corner together and the little piece that attaches to the corner and the section for the other crack. So that's all together now. Now I can start gluing those sections to the original bowl. So I'll flatten the faces that need to go together and cut out the shapes that I need from the striped parts. This will cut down on the sanding and make the turning a little easier. Now I can glue the striped piece to the original bowl. Now some of these operations I could use clamps, and some of them were where the clamps just weren't going to work, as the shapes didn't have a good surface and a good angle to actually put any pressure on the glue joint. This one worked okay. And I can do the outer piece. I think this just took one clamp right in the middle. Then I can work on the center piece, and the striped section on that needs to be cut to shape. So now I'll glue that striped section to the corner of the bowl that I'm keeping. This I really couldn't clamp, and I tried to use tape, and that didn't really work either. I ended up just putting a little pressure on it by hand for a couple of minutes, and that seemed to work okay. And once that's set, I can sand that seam so that that entire surface is nice and flat. Now that whole section can get glued to the new striped corner. Gluing all the stripes together and then trying to glue the corner in wouldn't have worked very well. So doing it this way, I can sort of hide that secondary seam in the stripes. So once that was dry, I tried sanding it on the drum sander, and that helped a little, but really to get it really flat, I need to put it on the disc sander. but there was less time spent at the disc sander, so that was good. Now this is the final glue up of the two halves of the bowl. And with this one, I just used the clamps as weights on the top to hold the seam together, which kind of worked. So now it's all glued together. And I thought I should probably remove some of the weight or some of the mass of the corner glue up, as that would make it hard on the lathe to turn. It would make it really unbalanced. So I ground off some of that material, which went pretty fast, and it really helped on the lathe. And at this point, it can look really messy. It doesn't have to be neat. It just has to be big enough to find the final bowl within. Then on the outside, I can just cut off the extra bit on the bandsaw. And it really doesn't have to be neat. And I really didn't have to do this, but it was fun. Now, the upper rim of the bowl is not very flat, as it's made up of all these different glue-ups. So that was going to make it really hard to mount on the lathe to make the mortise for the chuck to go in on the bottom of the bowl. So I figured I could mount it to the table of the CNC and get it level to my liking, then cut the circular mortise with the CNC machine. And this worked really well. And the chuck fit in there nicely. So now I can put this on the lathe. And it's somewhat balanced. It's not perfect, but it's good enough. Now it's just a matter of turning it. So I started with the rim and the outside. And I spent a lot of time on the outside. That seemed to take the most time. It looks a little unbalanced, but it really wasn't too bad. I think I had it a little above 400 RPM. Which was okay for something this size. And as it got more and more shaped, I could turn that speed up a little bit. And I started to work on the inside. Now, I was spending a lot of time watching the rim and the edge and making sure that wasn't getting too thin. And I kind of forgot about the bottom of the bowl and how deep the mortise that I had made for the chuck was. And I ended up cutting a little too deep in the bottom of the bowl, which I still hadn't realized at this point. So I scraped and got everything smooth, and I started to sand, and the sanding was going fine. Right here, I discovered that the bottom of the bowl was paper thin, and I could push on the center and it would move a little bit. You can just barely see it here. But what I remembered is that I had cut the mortise for the chuck on the CNC machine, so I had a perfectly flat bottom on the back of the bowl. So what I decided I could do is make a circular infill piece on the back that would give me a little more thickness. And I used a little piece of walnut for that. So the very bottom of the bowl would sort of be veneered to this infill piece. And I knew the exact size of that circle because it was on the computer as a file. So I could recut that circle perfectly and set it in place. And I put just a little bit of weight on the inside on the bottom to hold that really thin piece of walnut down to the new insert. And I made sure I left enough of the mortise that I could still hold the bowl on the lathe. And then it was just a matter of sanding. And it actually worked pretty well. I really wasn't sure if it was going to look terrible on the bottom of the bowl, like it was just going to come apart and be a glue mess at the bottom, but it seems to have worked pretty well. So now I need to do the bottom of the bowl. So I need to mount it backwards on the lathe. So I have a set of jaws for the chuck that I made that are about as big as the lathe will do. And I can move my mounting points to fit this particular bowl. So I just need to remove a little bit of the curve right at the bottom. And I have just enough material. In fact, parts of that new piece that I made are going to touch whatever surface the bowl gets put on, because there's very little rim on one side. And I can scrape that surface to get it smooth. And then sand. And I started pretty aggressively and then moved up through the different sandpapers. And it's done. Just needs finish. I spent a night worrying about whether that bottom was going to work. So one thing I do is, if I'm going to use an oil-based finish, I'll wipe it down with mineral spirits, and that'll get all the dust off and give a better finish. And I can put my mark on it and put some finish on it. And I'm just using butcher block oil. It gives a nice flat finish. So I cut this walnut up with my friend Gabe. And I made this bowl as a gift to him and his family. So I made you something.
Made me something? Oh, what?
So
wow.
That's the tree that we cut down.
That is awesome. That black walnut tree?
Oh, I like that part. That's right.
Yeah.
That is so cool. Thank you.
What's the light wood?
Maple.
Maple. And what's the wood? The light? Is that the dark? I mean, the same.
Yeah, same tree.
Okay. Oh, okay.
Oh, that is so cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
Nice. That's beautiful. Thank you. I'll have to put it on display somewhere.
Yeah.
That's your old treehouse tree.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, that's.
Memories.
Remember that tree that took out your treehouse?
Yeah.
This will forever haunt you.
Yeah.
So it got a little thin
Mm-hmm.
on the bottom, so I put a piece.
Oh, like a cap?
Yeah, like a little extra piece.
Nice. Oh, that's so cool. Thank you.
So you were able to turn that yourself?
Yeah. Yeah, this piece had cracked, and there was a big hole right here.
Oh, okay.
So I kind of cut it up.
Oh, that's so cool.
That's so neat.
It's hard to find a tree that has those stripes.
One place in the world they grow. Oh, that's so cool. Thank you.
Thanks for watching.